Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey, welcome back to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. Today is August 12, 2019. This is podcast number 34. Today we are going to talk about John Dewey. I am sure you have heard about him. He is a powerhouse in terms of philosophy, particularly when it comes to educational philosophy, education theory. So we are going to talk about his approach to education. And we will center on one of his famous books about education. So today we are going to examine the concept of education in terms of, its relevance in society over time. Meaning we are going to look at education from a chronological lens, but not necessarily in chronology, if you know what I mean. So we're going to look at education from two perspectives. We're going to look at education from, first, a traditional perspective, that is education based on traditional views. And on the other hand, we are going to examine the concept from a progressive perspective. As John Dewey puts it, there's this school of thought, this idea that education ought to be a certain way, but that way is supposed to reject the traditional view about education. So today we're going to look at those two approaches and try to make sense of what education is, what education should be in relation to its role in society, in relation to its importance in the life of those who are affected by it, because we are all affected by education. We ought to be educated. We ought to go to school. So one way or another, we are affected by one view. We are affected by education in terms of what education is thought to be. As usual, without further ado, let us delve right into it. Education is a very important aspect of human development. And what I mean by that is that education is the gateway towards a better living experience, at least in modern society. Education is a pillar, a pedestal, a means to an end. It is a way to be. It is a way to become. It is a way to accomplish. It is also a way to exist as an entity, as an individual. But the question becomes, what is the purpose of education? As I have sought to explain in my previous podcasts, at least in these series, education is understood a certain way. And that way is not necessarily the best way to understand education. But today we're going to appeal to a modern philosopher or a contemporary philosopher. Today we are going to examine education from the lens of John Dewey. Now, before we go further, let us provide a little bit of background on John Dewey. John Dewey is an American philosopher. He was born in 1859 and died in the 1950s. Particularly, he died in 1952. He was a psychologist. He was known as an educational reformer. And his ideals, his views about education had a tremendous impact on social reform, educational reform. And many consider him as the father of modern philosophy on education, or educational theory as it is commonly understood. But today we're going to look at one of his books. It is a book titled John Dewey, Experience in Education. In his book, he talks about the relationship between experience and education. He sort of laid down the ground upon which education is understood these days. But in this particular book, we are going to examine the concept of traditional versus progressive education. Basically, John Dewey has said that education could be understood in two ways. The first aspect of education is the concept known as traditional education. In a traditional approach to education, education is much more broad. It is generalized. It is based on certain societal norms and standards of rules of conduct. In this case, education is based on a transfer of information, skills that worked in the past, that have proven to be effective in society, and that information is passed down from one generation to the next. The information itself is transferred via a mechanism called the school, in which there is a teacher, there's an organized structure, there's a school principal, there's a curriculum, there is a certain structure as to how information is passed down from one individual to another. In this case, there's a teacher whose job is to transfer that knowledge. And that knowledge is sort of standardized based on certain rules of conduct, certain moral training, which would in turn induce conformity in the individual. So the traditional aspect of education is based on what is known, what has always been known, what is understood about the world, what has always been understood about the world, and that information is transferred to and fro. Okay? And it is done via an intermediary, and that intermediary in this case is a teacher, a person whose job is to teach, to provide information to the student or to the learner. So Dewey defines education as a process. It's a natural process in which the individual is learning how to overcome natural inclination to be a certain way and to substitute that inclination by habits which have been acquired via an external pressure or in an external process. But Dewey notes that education in and of itself has been challenged. This understanding about education has been put into question. And questioning that understanding about education has led to this movement, to this school of thought, which he defines as progressive education. Is this idea that there's a need to reject the traditional approach to education. There's a need to have a different outlook about education as opposed to looking at it from this archaic lens. That archaic lens is this idea that education ought to be an institutional transfer of knowledge. The goal of this institutional aspect or transfer of knowledge is to instruct the individual. And not only to instruct the individual, but also to instill a sense of discipline in him. And the idea is to prepare the individual for future responsibilities, which would enable him to succeed in life. Okay? And some of the key components of that approach to education include docility, respectivity, and obedience. In other words, the individual, in this case the learner, is learned to be docile, to be respectful, and to be obedient. Okay? The opposing view to that approach is the notion of education ought to instill freedom in the individual. Education is not supposed to be an oppressive tool. It is not supposed to be a tool of conformity. The individual ought to be able to use education, that is to have an education as a means to be free. Free from coercion, being able to enjoy freedom in a way that is not restrictive from a societal standpoint. Traditional education, according to the progressive lens, is preventing the individual from understanding his reality, because the individual is bound by certain archaic concepts, about certain archaic knowledge, certain things about the world that are not necessarily true at the time the individual is being inculcated that information. Okay? So traditional education is hindering the individual in his quest to freedom. So the education in and of itself, at least from a traditional standpoint, is an impediment to the development, to the growth of the individual. And the problem is that the individual is not prepared to be inculcated this level of coercion. The individual is not prepared for the, as Dewey puts it, the brutal features of traditional education. So the individual is not able to grasp what is being taught at this early age. And the education itself is already packaged. The individual has absolutely no say in what is being taught to him. The individual has absolutely no input as to the value of the information that is being transferred to him. It's already a packaged information. You go to school, you learn how to be, and you can only be that way. So that approach to education, Dewey said, is sort of restrictive because it's limited, it's narrow in scope, because what happens is that the individual only receives a little bit, very little information about the world as to how the world is. That approach to education assumes or presumes that the world has been a certain way and will always be a certain way, and the individual has to be prepared to deal with the world that way. So Dewey's saying, well, the progressive approach to education sort of rejects that view and is sort of questioned the validity of that understanding in terms of the world is changing. The individual, when he is forced to learn about the world a certain way, the individual is not being educated to the extent that the individual is limited as to what the world truly is. Dewey also sees a contradiction in the progressive approach to education. And that contradiction is that although, the progressive approach sort of saying we ought to look at education from a different aspect, but Dewey is like, I'm not sure what that is, because the progressive does not really lay out what is it they're going to do differently. They do not really provide something that is tangible to a point where it makes sense to the individual, because Dewey is saying you cannot instruct the individual without taking into account the past. If you are going to have an educational system that is based on looking at the individual in the present, you are also in the wrong, because now you are not taking into account what worked in the past. The individual is not able to consider the past to the extent that the individual can understand the present and shape the future in a meaningful way. So Dewey sort of argues that it is virtually impossible to have an educational system or an approach to learning, or a philosophy, if you will, about education that is not dogmatic in nature. You cannot take away the dogmatic approach to education. Okay? He's also asking himself, what options do we have? Well, the answer, we're going to debate it in a subsequent podcast, is not well defined in the progressive approach to education. Now, when we're talking about education from a traditional and a progressive stance, we ought to understand that it is this fallacy that we are rejecting one approach to another, which in and of itself cannot be independent. A progressive approach to education cannot in and of itself be independent from the traditional approach, okay? Because if you're talking about education in terms of you go to school to learn, well, the question is, why do we have to go to school in the first place? If every question about education starts with what is education, how we are going to define education, then the answer could only come from the traditional approach to education. Because the foundation of that understanding is based on traditions, is based on this this past or the previous understanding as to what education is or what it could be. And Dewey is saying, well, we ought to have a clearer understanding as to what we want education to be and how we are going to tie past experience with the present. Because we cannot say that past experience doesn't count. We cannot say what happened in the past has absolutely no relevance as to what's happening in the present or what might happen in the future. We ought to have an educational system that takes into account the past, the present, and consider the possibility for the future. And that approach to education makes perfect sense. Because now it is not an education based only on what was done in the past or what is doing today, but it is an education that is inclusive in it all. It is an education that takes into account the reality of the individual, not only in the past, but also in the present, not to mention taking into account the possibilities of the future. So an educational system that is that way, it's an educational system that is pragmatic in nature. So when we're talking about education as far as the difference between progressive and traditional, Dewey does not really see a real difference, because at the end of the day, the progressive approach to education is a rejection of the traditional, yet the progressive does not have a standing on its own. Somehow the progressive cannot turn its abstract principles into tangible realities. So at the end of the day, the progressive also relies on the past to some extent. But Dewey is not necessarily questioning the fact that the progressive approach to education relies on the past. What he's talking about for the most part is this idea that we ought to have an approach to education that is pragmatic in nature. And as we will see in subsequent podcasts, the pragmatic approach to education is one of the most important. As I've sought to explain in my previous podcast, when we talk about philosophy, when we talk about technology, when we talk about law, when we talk about all those categories, they are components of a whole picture, and that picture is the individual as far as freedom is concerned. Because all those categories, if you will, play an important role in how the individual perceives himself and how society perceives the individual. Because at the end of the day, it is that dichotomy that makes the individual, that allows the individual to make himself, and that gives preponderance to what the individual makes of himself, and that also provides relevance to what the individual makes of himself in the collective or in society as a whole. So education in and of itself has to be pragmatic. But we will discuss this a little bit further as we move forward in subsequent podcasts.